Millions of years ago, a molecule of CO2 was grabbed out of the air by a speck of algae floating on the surface of an ancient ocean. Using energy from sunlight, the algae stripped the carbon off of that CO2 and turned it into a complex organic molecule like sugar or fat. That carbon atom became integrated into living tissues and spent days, weeks, or even months as part of the algae speck. When that algae died, it sank and ferried the carbon atom down to the bottom of the ocean, where it came to rest alongside all of the other algae and organisms that had died before it. As rivers shifted, sediment dropped onto new parts of the ocean floor, and that single carbon atom that once floated freely through the air was buried deeper and deeper underground. Time passes, pressure grows, and the organic molecules break down into simple hydrocarbons, raw materials that we call oil, coal, and natural gas. After millions of years locked underground, a well is drilled, oil is pumped and processed, and that carbon atom is now above ground, filling your car's gas tank. On average, the gas you pump today was unrefined oil in an underground reservoir about a month ago. On your way to work tomorrow, that little carbon atom will ignite in your engine and be released to float through the air again as carbon dioxide. Hopefully, one day soon, another speck of algae or some other plant will snatch our carbon molecule out of the air and lock it back into organic tissues. This is the fundamental imbalance of the human-altered carbon cycle. We're putting carbon into the air faster than nature can remove it. It's not an impossible problem to solve, and there are some incredible solutions helping the process along. Today's guest is Dr. Max Holmes of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, studying the most important things in the most important places, working to restore balance to our planet's climate.
Welcome to Conservation Connection, the show where we do just that, connect you to what's happening in the field of conservation. I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is the show.
So I would say that one of the most highly debated topics right now is, when do you start putting up your Christmas tree? So I want to get your input. Obviously, we just had Halloween. Some people are like, it's Christmas now until Thanksgiving, the day of Thanksgiving. Great, Thanksgiving. And then we're back on the Christmas holiday train. So what's your view on this, Chance?
I think you know that I have very passionate views about this, mostly because my favorite holiday is Halloween. And it frustrates me to no end when I see Christmas decorations in stores for sale in like mid-October.
Yeah, but there's also Halloween decorations.
We went into Sam's Club and by like October 10th, there was like a tiny Halloween section and then Christmas, which I get, we're following consumer trends. But my heart says that on November 1st is when you start to put out your Thanksgiving themes, you know, your cornucopia if you have one, your gourd. And then after Thanksgiving, it's free for all. But I do fully respect that you should decorate your space in however makes you happy. I mean, probably by late August, we were playing Christmas music because it makes you so happy. Not all the time, mind you.
Right.
And not Mariah Carey. But, you know,
we love some good Michael Bublé Christmas music on in the house to, like, start our day, make us happy.
Elvis Presley Christmas album.
Yeah.
I'm down for it.
Just occasional.
Do what makes you happy, but
yeah.
But don't minimize the other holidays. Like, Thanksgiving has a place. Anyway, that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, I like to have a mix of, like, we still have our fall Thanksgiving decorations, but we also start throwing in some Christmas in there. You know, maybe not setting up a Christmas tree or something, but, like, we love some good twinkle lights. We love, you know, a winter-themed shower curtain.
Little sprinkles here and there, I think, are a good thing.
Yeah. So, speaking of all of these holiday things, now is a great time to point out that we will be sending out some Happy New Year's cards at the end of the year, obviously. So, we still have some time. But if you want one of those cards from Conservation Connection from me and Chance, you can text our hotline.
That number is 706-505-0582. If you've already texted the hotline and we've sent you a sticker pack, I'm probably going to send you a card just for being a listener, and I appreciate you. But if you haven't reached out to us on the hotline yet, and you want a holiday card or a New Year's card, reach out.
the likelihood that our dogs will be featured on this card is high.
I would argue 100%. I can't see any world in which our dogs are not on our holiday card.
That's fair. So, send us a text if you want one, and I guess you'll find out.
And if you can't wait until the end of the year for a card, if you text us and let us know how you found the show, or that you've rated us, or that you've shared us with a friend, I'll send you a free sticker pack. So text the hotline, 706-505-0582.
Now let's get into a couple of the topics that we're going to be talking about in this episode. So in this episode, you can expect to hear topics about carbon credits, about some natural climate solutions, what that looks like, some of the work that the Woodwell Climate Center does, and of course, plenty of Dr. Max Holmes's expertise and background.
Yeah, this was a fun conversation for me in particular because I'm only sort of aware of what happens with the carbon market, but I know that it is really controversial for a lot of people. And so we get to ask him kind of some heavy-hitting questions about, like, is this a good thing? Is it greenwashing? Really what's happening behind the scenes. And I think he's got some really cool answers for that. I also like that he talks about nature-based solutions a lot, which is one of the primary focuses of the Woodwell Climate Center, is they're looking not to invent new technologies, but to allow nature's technology to help us solve the climate crisis.
Yeah, that was something that I think makes sense, that we have these different climate solutions, right? But I hadn't ever really separated in my mind, like, oh, we have natural solutions and we have man-made solutions. So our solar power, our windmills, stuff like that. But then, of course, we have nature that's just doing what it's always done and kind of making the world go round. So yeah, I really, really loved this conversation with Dr. Max Holmes. I hope that you listening love it as well. This is another episode that we recorded at the Sun Valley Forum in Sun Valley, Idaho in July.
And this is a really good example of the kind of conversations we get to have at Sun Valley, where we're talking to an expert in their space about what they do, but they have the opportunity to talk to other experts. So somebody who works in carbon markets is talking to somebody who works in sustainable fashion, is talking to somebody who works in regenerative agriculture. And all of these ideas get to kind of enter this melding pot, and awesome things come out of it.
Right. And something that I love about the opportunity we have with Conservation Connection is that some of these speakers only have, 15, 20 minutes on the stage to talk about the things they're talking about. So then some of them get the opportunity to come talk to us and expand upon it. Even after our interview with Dr. Holmes, we were talking to some friends at dinner and they were like, I don't know about carbon credits. Like, I don't think those are good. Like, I'm very hardline. And I told them, I was like, I'm really excited for you to hear this episode because I didn't know what to think about them either before we got to have this conversation. And I feel like I'm more educated about it now. And that's kind of the point of the show. It's just like trying to teach you a little bit more about something you may or may not know about. And so you can make a more informed decision.
Yeah, and I think that's what everybody should be doing every day, right? Just learn a little bit. You don't have to go read a textbook about something, but taking small steps every day, every week, whatever it is how you really progress as a person. So with all that, buckle up, enjoy this episode.
We are so excited to be back at the Sun Valley Forum, and today we're even more excited to be joined by Dr. Max Holmes. He is the president and CEO of Woodwell Climate Research Center.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you on the show because you are such a decorated scientist and you have done so many incredible things. I mean, you were elected the National Fellow of the Explorers Club. You're the director of the U.S. National Science Foundation's Arctic System Science Program, just to name a few. Was it Science on the Fly? Is that the name of the fly fishing org?
Yeah, that's the project of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, along with Fish Pond. So yeah, I've done some different things. The thing at NSF was 10 years ago, but yeah.
It's still really cool.
So let's get started just by what brings you out to the Sun Valley Forum this year.
Well, so it's the first time I've been to the forum. It's the first time I've been to Sun Valley, but some of my colleagues were here last year and told me about just the amazing collection of people that were here from all different backgrounds and places and perspectives. And so it sounded like a good crowd to get to know and interact with. And yeah, this is the third day now of the conference, and it's just been exactly as advertised, all those things I just said, ideas flying around, but everybody really sharing the common goal of let's make this planet better. Let's do something about climate change. Let's pass on the world we want to future generations. So it's really inspiring conference and collection of people working on these issues.
So before we did this interview and I reached out to you, you sent me a video of a talk that you gave recently. And you were talking a lot about renewable energy, different types of carbon capture, and kind of just running the gambit in that space, like everything that you're seeing there right now. Is that kind of one of the main focuses of Woodwell right now?
Really what we focus on are natural climate solutions, so protecting and restoring forests and soils. And that's absolutely essential to do that if we're going to solve the climate crisis. But it's also essential that we get off of fossil fuels. That's the biggest source of heat trapping gases to the atmosphere, the coal, oil, and natural gas, the combustion of those things. So we've got to put the brakes on there. And in that talk that I gave a few weeks ago, I was, as you said, sort of covering the range of topics and expressing my enthusiasm for progress that's finally being made on ramping up clean energy sources, which again is essential if we're going to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of the messaging that we've heard around this climate crisis has been very doom and gloom, and that, even the best case scenario is not good, but you seem to carry around a lot of hope and a lot of inspiration that our best case scenario is still A, achievable, and B, a really good scenario. So can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. And my thoughts have evolved over time, but I definitely agree that what we typically hear is the doom and gloom. And the reality is it's bad, mm-hmm. and it's going to get worse. I always often get the question, how do you keep doing this day after day, week after week, year after year, when you're not really making progress? And, I've started getting that question probably 20 years ago. And my answer would be along the lines of what you alluded to. There's sort of a worst case scenario and there's a best case scenario. Over the years, and particularly just over the last few years, my answer has shifted. And that's because I'm looking farther out now. As I already alluded to, some of the solutions are really ramping up. And there are lots of really smart people working on additional solutions. So I can start to see, it's a little bit blurry, a little bit foggy. It's out there a ways, but there actually is a path to a positive future. And that doesn't mean I'm at all confident that we're going to get there, but I am absolutely certain it's possible that we can get there. And that's kind of what fires me up and keeps me driving as hard as I can go.
What are some of the success stories that you've seen, whether it be with renewable energy or something else? But in your time, like Chance said, you have a long history in this field and you've done so much. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of stuff along the way.
Yeah, I'll talk maybe some of the technological approaches, then I can talk about the natural climate solutions, forests and soils and so on. Yeah. But on the tech side, solar. Mm-hmm. Solar is just absolutely exploding. And it's good to remind people this is a technological solution to climate change. And a lot of people in my community are kind of dismissive of technological approaches.
Right.
And we're all used to solar, but where did that come from? That came from investors and government support. And it was really expensive initially and not so long ago, and it didn't scale. And all of a sudden it is just absolutely taking off in the last few years around the world, in the US, in China, in Europe, you name it. It is in most places the cheapest way to make electricity right now. And we're early on in the ramping up of solar energy production. So that's incredibly exciting. Similar with wind, the trajectory hasn't quite been as steep recently. It's had more bumps in the road, but the potential is huge.
If you want to hear more about some of the challenges that wind power is facing, as well as some of the research going into solutions, you can listen to our episode from last season, Saving Bats from Wind Farms. We had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Sarah Fritz about her research, which is making wind farms a safer space for bats and migratory birds.
So those are things that give me great hope that there is a path to get off of fossil fuels. We will get off of fossil fuels. If we look out 100 years from now,
there's no way.
We're not going to be dumping gasoline into our cars to move our cars. We're not going to be burning coal to heat our buildings. We're not going to be using natural gas. So that's good. But 100 years is, and on the one hand, it's a super long time, and on the other hand, it's not such a long time. But we need to move quickly. And, so the question is now how, like, we're really close to peak emissions right now. Potentially we're at peak emissions. We won't know until we're kind of past it and we see the peak. But then the question is, how quickly do we come down the other side? I think one thing that my community, the climate community, is not so good about, and there are good reasons why we're not good about it, because we're in the middle of a crisis and we focus on that. But when we finally hit that peak emissions, and again, I think we may be there, that's something to celebrate. When we start coming down the other side, and I hope when people see us coming down the other side, they'll, the spirits will be buoyed and we will see that we can actually make progress on that thing. And I think you can have a kind of a self-reinforcing cycle of negativity, gloom and doom, but I think you can have a self-reinforcing cycle of positivity. And hey, we're actually making progress now. Let's go.
Yeah, when you can see that graph and it goes up, 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 and now it starts to go down and down and down and down. And it's like, okay, we know that this is where we're headed. We might as well adapt as early as we can so that we can be kind of at the forefront of this.
Yeah. And so we're talking about emissions right now where we're going to hit the peak. CO2 concentration, we're not at the peak yet. That will keep going up for a while, and I don't know how much it will lag. But when we hit the peak there with carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere and start to see that come down, I don't know if I'll see that in my lifetime, but it'll happen, and that'll be incredibly exciting.
Yeah. I wonder if 100 years from now, kids are going to ask the question of like, did they call them fossil fuels because we don't use them anymore? Like, it's this old thing that we don't do. And, I don't know. I just think that'll be a very interesting conversation that I'll never get to hear.
I think they'll be baffled, like absolutely baffled to try to explain to somebody 100 years from now what gasoline was. This is flammable, dangerous, explosive stuff that we would put in our cars and make it move. And it came from who knows where in the world, out of the ground. And it'll just... It's actually, so I think in the not terribly distant future, much less than 100 years from now, we'll start to fill that. And I'm actually, like, I have a plug-in hybrid, so it can run on electricity or gas, but it's starting to feel bad to me when I have to stick this hose into my tank and squeeze it, and this stuff comes out, and I know of the consequences of that. And I think, that's going to, more and more people are going to feel that, and it's just going to start to feel bad to put gasoline in a car when there's such a better alternative out there.
It's funny. It reminds me a little bit about, this is totally wild and off topic, but it reminds me a little bit of how people used to like burn mummies as firewood because it was a cheap flammable thing that they could do and use. And you look at that now in 2024 and that's horrifying, that idea. But I think that we're going to see that same kind of conversation around fossil fuels in that same way.
Yeah. You used to burn stuff for energy, for heat, for power, for all these things. And that, it's just going to be a different way.
Yeah. So when you say we're at peak emissions and we think we should see them start to go down soon, what exactly does that mean? Explain to me.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm not sure if we're at peak emissions, but potentially we are. And if we're not yet, hopefully we will soon. And so what I mean by that, I'm talking about emissions of greenhouse gases, heat trapping gases, carbon dioxide primarily. That's coming from burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Anyone who's alive today, 110-year-old person somewhere, all they've seen in their life over those 110 years or whatever are emissions, greenhouse gas emissions increasing year after year after year after year. There have been a couple of little downswings with recessions or a pandemic, but that's a year or two, and then we've recovered, let's say, from the pandemic, and emissions have gone up since then. So that's all we've ever seen. We're using more and more coal, oil, and natural gas over the last, since the start of the Industrial Revolution. That leads to more emissions and problems with climate, et cetera. So it's just this like dramatic change where population is still growing. Hopefully quality of life continues to increase around the world. So it's not like we're cutting off the energy supply and starving people of energy. It's we just have a better way of generating that energy.
Okay. So emissions will start going down because we have different resources and ways to create energy.
Yeah, we're displacing fossil fuel use with renewable or other clean energy sources.
Yeah. And so in your line of work, you're starting to see a transition to there being more renewable resources than these like fossil fuels and everything else that we're using.
Yeah, that's right.
That's awesome.
The clean energy sources are coming on in a big way.
I love that.
And this is not I love it too. I mean, it's super exciting. At Woodwell Climate Research Center, that is not the focus of most of our work. We focus on natural climate solutions and forests and soils, but the stuff we're doing only matters if we solve this other thing, and if this other thing is solved, and if we stop spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through our processes of producing energy. So it's exciting to see this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good segue between this is a two-pronged problem, right? We have to stop adding more carbon into the atmosphere, but we also have to remove carbon out of the atmosphere that we have been dumping into it for the last couple hundred years, right? So that's the other part and the big focus of what you're doing at Woodwell Climate Research Center is looking at nature-based solutions for decarbonizing the atmosphere, right?
Exactly. Well, there are two aspects of that. So fossil fuel combustion is a kind of a one-way arrow putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. If we turn that off, it goes to zero. That arrow disappears. The good and the bad of forests, for example, is that right now we're losing forests. We're deforesting. We're cutting down trees. When we do that, the trees burn, et cetera. All that carbon that's been locked up in the trees ends up in the atmosphere. So the two biggest sources of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere are, number one, the use of fossil fuels. Number two, land use change, primarily deforestation. So we need to put the brakes on deforestation so we're no longer putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere through cutting down trees. But the really cool thing about it is, unlike fossil fuels, you can reverse that arrow. And by letting trees grow and restoring soils and building up organic carbon in soils, you can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in the biosphere.
I think that's one of the most mind-blowing facts I ever learned was that when you're standing in front of a tree, like close your eyes, not if you're driving, picture that you're standing in front of a tree. The vast majority of the weight of that tree, if you don't include the water that's in those tissues, is carbon-based molecules, and trees don't pull carbon out of the soil. They pull carbon out of the air. They're literally turning air into wood, and that's how we're pulling carbon atoms out of the atmosphere and locking it up, sequestering it away in the biosphere.
Absolutely. That's it. And it is photosynthesis. Everyone learns about it in fifth grade or whatever. It is an unbelievable process. And I mean, I think of the same thing. You look at a little seed that, can turn into a giant sequoia or any tree, right? And where did that tree come from? It came from what's in the air, from the carbon in the air, photosynthesis pulling it out of the air and building the biomass of that tree. So photosynthesis is a wonderful process. We need to let it do its thing. We need to, restore forests and soils where we can, and reverse that arrow.
And that's why you're talking primarily about nature-based solutions, right? Because technological solutions, things that humans build, are good, but they're not nearly as efficient as what nature is already doing if we allow it to do what it's done since the dawn of time, right?
Yeah, we need both. We need both of those things. But, the beauty of nature-based solutions, in addition to the carbon part of the story, which is what we've been focusing on, forests, for example, do lots of other things besides hold carbon and help stabilize the climate. They're the home of much of the world's biodiversity. They're home to many of the world's remaining indigenous populations. They're just they clean the water. They do all of these things for us beyond just the carbon benefit, which is absolutely essential. So, if you're not into the carbon, which I can't imagine anyone in the world not geeking out on carbon like I do and we do right here, there are lots of other reasons to protect forests.
Mm-hmm. That's a perfect time to transition. I think you told us the story before this about that you were recently in the Amazon, right? Doing some research. And I would love for you to tell us once again, so our audience can hear, about your recent travels to the Amazon.
Yeah, so we were visiting a site in the Brazilian Amazon, a site where scientists at the Woodwell Climate Research Center have worked for 20 years or so with colleagues from around the world and certainly in Brazil. But it was the first time I had visited this particular site, and it's in the Amazon, in the Amazon rainforest, but it's at the sort of the agricultural frontier. So it's a region that probably 30 years ago it was just completely intact forest. Now it is massive agricultural region. So maybe half the forest is gone in this area. And we're trying to study how the remaining forests are doing, how their health is, how to maybe increase the agricultural productivity on the land that is already in agriculture such that there's less pressure to deforest more. We have, various experiments going on both in the forest and the agricultural systems. We visited and walked through the forest and saw monkeys in the trees and just, this amazing experience. And then the next day as we're leaving, we're flying out, and in a sort of a neighboring farm, there was smoke, and, fire is a big issue in the Amazon. So just, I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I was taking photos with my phone. And then when I got home and could look on a bigger screen, I could tell what had happened was this is an area. And then I also looked back in Google Earth 6 months ago. 6 months ago, it was forested. Now it was deforested. And what they do is basically two big monstrous bulldozers with a very heavy chain between them, and they just drive along, and every tree that gets knocked over by this massive chain, they let it dry out for a while and then burn it, which is what they were doing when I saw it, and then they convert it to agriculture. So that was just this. I mean, I know it continues. There's continued to be something like 8,000 square kilometers of Amazon forest deforested each year. So I can tell you this like intellectually, but seeing it just hit me. Like hit me. The day before I had seen monkeys in a forest very nearby, and then you see this thing that had just been deforested, and so it's like, okay, how in the hell do we figure out how to put the brakes on that? Recognizing and respecting the legal rights of the landowners and so on. And in many cases, there are many different forces that lead to deforestation. And in some cases, it's just, a poor farmer trying to feed his or her family. And if I was in that same position, if I was trying to feed my kids and I could do it by cutting down a tree, I would cut down that tree. So how do we make it such that a tree standing is worth more than a tree cut down, and get that and somehow compensate the people on the ground in those places at recognizing that value. So that's a big thing that we're thinking about at Woodwell.
Yeah. I think us in the room, and so many of us are so privileged to not have to worry about those things, and to be able to be concerned about climate change and like, oh, how can I help the planet? But sometimes we forget that, like you said, people are doing these things out of necessity to feed their family. And so I think the great solution that y'all are kind of looking at is like, okay, how do we make it more profitable for them not to have to cut down these trees? What are ways we can help them have income and everything they need, and also protect the environment? Yeah,
that's right. And, I and everyone here at the Sun Valley Forum, or almost everyone here at the Sun Valley Forum, has a very comfortable life relative to the vast majority of people in the world. And so we and I have to be very careful about saying, you can't do this anymore.
Right.
We have to, we want the developing world to continue to develop. I want kids that are hungry to have food and education and healthcare and all of those things. And how did we get rich in our country? By using our natural resources, by deforesting, by exploiting fossil fuels. And that's the quickest way to get rich, let's say. But now we recognize the costs of that globally with the climate. So
it's really hard to be on this side and be like, we did it first. We, benefit from it. We live these very high quality lives. But we're like, oh, that's not good. You can't do that. This, who are we to say that, we did it first, just kind of out of happenstance, and now we recognize that that's not a good thing, so I'm not going to allow anybody else to do that.
Yeah. So, just as a moral issue, it's not right to do that without saying, and here's the better alternative. Here's how you can do it in a way that's better for you, and it's better for your future and your kids' future. And, oh, by the way, it's better for us too in the whole world. And the good thing is there are answers to those questions,
Right.
But we need to work on them fast, because there are a lot of hungry people around the world that are, trying to figure out how to provide for their families. And it's not good enough for us just to say, no, you can't do that because it's impacting the global climate. And they look at the lifestyles we have and how those lifestyles have impacted the global climate. And it's not just.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ways y'all are looking at tackling this issue is through carbon credits. Is that right?
Yeah. I'd say broadly the carbon markets. And the basic issue there is companies around the world, countries around the world, people around the world are saying, we're going to get to net zero by 2050 or 2040 or 2030. And what that means, this net zero, is that first they'll try to reduce their own, or they will reduce their own emissions of greenhouse gases. But some things right now are really hard to totally get rid of. There aren't airplanes flying on batteries aviation for the most part. And there are some others. And so there's still emissions associated with things like that. The net part of that net zero is, okay, for the things I can't get rid of, the emissions I can't get rid of, I can purchase offsets or credits from somebody else who has done something to reduce emissions that otherwise wouldn't have happened. So getting to the example of forests or natural climate solutions, and we spoke a minute ago about how I had just seen this forest in the Amazon that had been cleared in the last few months. If I knew that was going to happen, and I could have said to this guy, hey, instead of cutting this down, we can get you some money. We can compensate you for not cutting it down and then generate credits for the emissions, the carbon emissions that weren't released to the atmosphere. That's the basic idea of carbon markets.
So like if there's a small farm in the Amazon that's a couple of acres, you can calculate how many tons of carbon does that acreage pull out of the atmosphere in a single year. And say, okay, let's say it pulls, I'm not going to know the right number here, 2 tons of carbon out in this farm. So then we go to a business that is producing 2 tons of carbon annually when they're producing by burning fossil fuels and say, okay, you can either stop using fossil fuels or you can send money to this farm that is pulling as much carbon out of the air as you're putting into the air to offset the impact that you're having on the environment.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. Another nuance of it is, so you're talking about the amount of carbon that was pulled out each year, and you can think of a growing forest. Let's say you're restoring a forest, and how much additional carbon is it accumulating each year? The other aspect of it, though, is in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, there are about 300 tons of carbon per hectare. A hectare is around 2.5 acres, so what is that? 100 tons per acre or something like that, if I got that conversion right. That's a lot of carbon, right? And it's not that it's pulling 100 tons out each year, but over the years and decades that forest has matured, that's how much is stored in the wood and soils of that forest, or the wood of the forest. So 300 tons per hectare, 100 tons per acre, very roughly.
Yeah.
So you can say you can generate credits, not just on the amount that's pulled out per year, but the amount that is stored there, that if that forest was deforested, cut down and burned, that's how much would go to the atmosphere. So yeah, it's challenging, but it's absolutely essential that we figure out ways to preserve the forests we have. Yes, we should be restoring those that have already been degraded, deforested, cut down, but it takes a long time to build back the carbon in a forest in the Amazon or anywhere else, decades, even centuries, and you may never get back some of those other things that we care about, the biodiversity, the people that live there and rely on those, and so on. So yeah, we need to do both, but protecting what we have is probably the highest priority, just because of the timelines that it takes to rebuild it and the rapidity with which all that carbon that's in that forest can end up in the atmosphere once it's burned.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There is some controversy around carbon credits. There's a lot of people in this space that think that they're kind of a cop-out, that they're, allowing businesses to continue with poor practices and just throw money at the problem. I don't think that that's a fair take on carbon credits, but I want to get your opinion on that kind of line of thought.
So there's certainly a lot of controversy and a diversity of views on carbon markets. And much of it is what's called a voluntary carbon market. And I think that word voluntary is super important. I don't think most people appreciate it, which means you don't have to do it. And there was some really impressive, I think, important studies that came out in the last year that showed that the companies that are engaged in the voluntary carbon markets, purchasing credits or offsets from that voluntary carbon market, are actually doing much more to reduce their own emissions. So yeah, the argument against is, it's just a cop-out. It's a cheap way for companies to get off the hook.
It's like greenwashing.
And greenwashing, to not do what they're supposed to be, not do the hard stuff on their own emissions. What this study has shown, or what these studies are showing, is the companies that are buying credits from the voluntary carbon market are actually doing a lot more to reduce their own emissions. And on the one hand, I think it's not surprising, because it's voluntary. They don't have to do any of it,
Right.
And it's a shame, in my view, that I should say there are problems with the carbon markets, and some of those carbon credits that have been generated have proven not to be worthwhile, have proven essentially not to be real. And so some of these companies that have tried to buy quality carbon offsets voluntarily have gotten just raked through the coals in the media because they purchased these credits, these offsets that didn't do any good. So they pull back and they say, look,
why would I spend money on this if I'm going to get yelled at by the public about it?
Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to buy quality carbon credits. I'm not really sure which ones are the quality ones at this point, so they pull back. And that the market is shrinking because of that reason. Some would say, okay, this is a good thing. Carbon markets just aren't ever going to work. It's a scam. It's et cetera, et cetera. Our perspective at Woodwell Climate Research Center is, yes, there are problems, but those problems can largely be fixed, and the kind of science that we're involved in can help solve those things. So that's a big focus of ours right now. The other thing I just bring up, that for those people who, and they're not bad people, everyone's operating with integrity, but those who focus on the problems of carbon markets and just think we should be out, what's the alternative? What's an alternative to mobilize the amount of money it's going to take to keep the Amazon standing, to make it such that the person on the ground with the chainsaw can see a way forward to feed his or her family without cutting down that tree? That's what we need to work on. And nobody's come up with a really viable alternative to potentially mobilize the amount of money it's going to take to get the job done.
I feel very strongly that in most things, the middle road tends to be the most viable answer forward. And so I think that it is absolutely fair to take a really hard look at the carbon market and say, there's so many vulnerabilities here in which a company could greenwash, or somebody who's selling carbon credits could be taking the money and not doing what they're going to say with it. But that doesn't mean that it cannot be and should not be a really important part of solutions, right? There is no single solution. We have to be looking at multiple avenues, and carbon credits are one of the first globally accepted ways for a business to sign a check, and that check directly helps the environment, and it is good business to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. And, again, there are problems, and you could say there are problems, forget it, we're done. Or you can say there are problems, let's fix them. And we're taking that second approach. There are problems, and let's fix them.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's such a complex thing, right? I mean, even just in this conversation, I'm like throwing all these questions at you about like, what is it? Why should we do it? Is it greenwashing? All of that kind of stuff. And I think there's so much information out there. If you Google carbon credits, you're going to see something that says, oh, wow, carbon credits are great. And you're going to see another article that's like, this is why carbon credits are terrible. And it's just like, how do you exist in a world like this, right? It's just like paralysis, honestly.
Yeah, it's a immature market without clear rules and without clear ways of assessing quality, which means it's hard to price. And I'm not an economist, and I don't have great expertise in this, but I think it's not maybe atypical of early stages in any market where it's a bit Wild West, and there are bumps in the roads or problems that arise and not everything works, but then you solve those problems and end up with something that makes a lot more sense, and you actually know what it is you're buying, and you can figure out what the right price is, and it does what it's supposed to do. We're not there yet, but that's where we need to get.
It reminds me actually a little bit of, and I am not very knowledgeable about this at all, but from the outside, the way you're talking about as a young market that's still kind of developing the roadmap, it reminds me a lot of early cryptocurrency, where there was like, hey, there's this thing, it seems like a really interesting financial instrument, and it's decentralized, and we're not really sure how it's regulated, but there's something here, and we just need to figure out and solve these problems, and it can be a really viable solution forward.
Yeah, I think there's probably a good analogy there, and I know even probably a lot less about cryptocurrency than you do, so I don't want to go too far down that road. But yeah, fundamentally, it is I think probably still is an immature market where nobody's quite sure about it, and maybe those things get worked out. A difference between these two things is one of them we're talking about, I can look at the trees in the Amazon and, that's what we're trying to protect, or in the Congo or whatever it is. And
exactly right.
All we can try to do is keep trying to do the next best thing. We can only use what we have access to right now until we figure out something better. And that's the best we can do. Yeah,
that's right. And, carbon markets have the potential to be a really important tool for protecting and restoring forests and soils and other natural systems. We need to do, it is one of the tools in the toolbox. It's a super important one, but there are others. There are regulatory approaches. Most of the deforestation in the Amazon is illegal. And I don't think a carbon market works there. You're not going to, there needs to be better enforcement and so on. There's lots of different things.
Yeah.
Which is almost another interesting aspect to talk about. How do we get money into the space is like, okay, so we could either be looking at this as carbon in, carbon out, or like how much carbon is in the space. But I also wonder if there's an avenue for instruments of being like, instead of paying directly for the carbon, I'm paying for the protection of that carbon. Like I'm paying for enforcement. I'm going to be the funding source for this forestry agency so that they can have people out in the field making sure that those woods stay protected.
Yeah, absolutely. And the term of art right there is payment for ecosystem services. So you're not buying carbon credits. You're saying, okay, we're going to send some money to do something else that's going to protect forests or soils or restore those kinds of things. So yeah, and that's another great approach, right? I think the difference right now is what's generated a potential huge amount of money in the carbon market space is all of these companies just in the last handful of years making net zero pledges and only having a way to get to that net zero by purchasing some offsets. They'll reduce their own, but there'll be residual and they need to purchase it. So that creates this huge potential in the carbon markets. But yeah, there are other approaches that are underway that work. We need all of them. But yeah, we're enthusiastic about the potential of the carbon market based on the scale of the amount of money it's going to take to solve the issues and the fact that this is the one way that I can see to mobilize that amount of money.
Mm-hmm. We really kind of took you on this deep journey down a rabbit hole. But now I want to go back and ask, what project are you most excited for that you're working on right now?
Boy, that's also a tough one. And I'm not going to choose one.
Choose your favorite.
What's your favorite kid, And we try to work at Woodwell Climate Research Center in the most important places on the most important questions. So that takes us to the Arctic, for one. We spend a lot of time in the Arctic. We're interested in the Arctic for lots of different reasons, but a lot of them are also based on carbon, as we've been talking about. And there's vast amounts of carbon locked up in frozen ground in the Arctic, permafrost in the Arctic, if you've heard that term. And as the Earth is warming, the Arctic's warming even much more, and that frozen ground is starting to thaw. And this carbon that's built up over millennia in the Arctic is starting to be released. When that frozen ground thaws, that organic matter, that organic carbon decomposes, and it releases greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and methane. So
that's carbon that came from like a time when this wasn't a frozen piece of land.
It's carbon that came. So there's still there's plants growing in the Arctic. It's very slow growth in the Arctic because of the cold temperatures and limited time of light and so on. But plants are growing up there, but they've decomposed, they've rotted even slower. So over a long time, even though the productivity of the plant growth is low, the decomposition is even slower. So if you contrast that to the tropics, for example, plant growth much, 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 much higher, but the decomposition, a leaf falls on the ground, it's not going to be there pretty soon. The decomposition is much greater, so you don't build up this vast amount of carbon in soils like you do in frozen ground in the Arctic.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. and it's like, so it's this huge stock of ancient organic matter, organic carbon that's just been frozen away. I mean, and you can put a bunch of vegetables in your freezer at home. They're going to stay vegetables in your freezer at home as long as your freezer remains a freezer. But if, you lose electricity for a while, what happens? You go home, you smell that stuff, it's rotting. That rotting is bacteria using those vegetables that were frozen as an energy source and, again, releasing greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and methane. So that's what's happening in the Arctic. This ground that's been frozen for, in many cases, thousands of years is thawing. That organic matter that's built up by plants and animals decomposing slowly is now starting to rot. And so at any rate, one of my things I get most excited about is the work we're doing there, trying to figure out just exactly how much carbon is there when it thaws, how quickly does it decompose. When it decomposes, does it go off as carbon dioxide or methane, because that influences that amount of warming. And then we're improving the models of that permafrost thaw and greenhouse gas emissions and getting that information to the policymakers who are hopefully setting wise climate policies at international and other levels. And in that project, we're also working with people on the ground, indigenous people on the ground in Alaska, helping them adapt to what's already happening with permafrost thaw. Permafrost is a great surface for moving across and so on, walking, skiing, you name it. And this is what they've done for thousands of years. But as it thaws, it's a big mess. And
now they can't easily get across those places.
And some of their villages are eroding away. So they need to right now adapt in ways that are super challenging and from a regulatory standpoint and so on. So we work with them to hopefully provide any assistance we can as they're struggling with adaptation. So that's one project I'm really excited about. We've spoken about, we do a lot of work in the tropics, in the Amazon and the Congo, and try to figure out how to keep those trees standing. And again, for the carbon perspective, but everything else that a forest does for all of us and for the people there and for the biodiversity and stuff. Let's see, other things I'm really excited about. I mean, we're always looking for, fundamentally, broadly, what we do is try to do the most important science and connect that to impact. And so it's not enough just to do really cool science. For us at Woodwell Climate, it's how do we have an impact with that science. So we work a lot at the international level with climate policy. So we're always at the COPs and trying to push the needle there. We work at the federal level, and that varies. We do what we can when we can, mm-hmm. And so we always work with members of Congress and their staff to try to make sure they understand the science and have good advice about what to do about it. Two of my predecessors as president of Woodwell have been in the White House as science advisors. So John Holdren was President Obama's science advisor for all 8 years of his administration. And Phil Duffy, my immediate predecessor 3 years ago, also got a call from the White House and is a climate advisor in the White House now. So those are just examples of ways we try to connect to impact.
How many scientists are connected to the Woodwell Climate Research Center?
We have about 150 staff total. That's roughly doubled in size over the past few years. More than half are scientists. The absolute number, I'm not sure. But we're 150 total. Roughly half are based in Woods Hole. So our headquarters are in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. But the other half are spread around the country and even around the world. And so, it's an exciting place. And it's I think people are drawn there and stay there because of the mission, the excitement for the science that we're doing, the importance of it, but the fact that we are doing whatever we can to have that science make a difference and change the direction that we're headed. If you're studying climate change, it's not satisfying to just study the problem and watch the problems mount and mount and mount. And so, that's what kind of puts a smile on my face thinking about, okay, what can we do to actually have the science that we do help put the brakes on climate change and make it so that we're handing off a world that would all want to live in, or our children's or grandchildren, or even much farther down the road. What we do now matters. The way I would frame it is, it would have been a lot better if we started yesterday. it's a lot better to start today than tomorrow. But it's never too late, but it's time to go. And the stuff that we do now, today and tomorrow, are going to have a big impact for what this planet, this magnificent planet, looks like 100 years from now and 1,000 years from now and 10,000 years from now. And that's a pretty heady thing to think about, but it's actually really true.
Yeah, completely agree with that.
I feel like you tied this interview up nicely in a bow, and that is a perfect place to end on. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. That's a big part of the puzzle as well, telling the story.
Hopefully you got as much out of that conversation as we did while we were interviewing Dr. Max Holmes.
Yeah, he was just a cool guy.
He was really nice.
I was really struck by their mission of doing the most important work in the most important places. I think any scientist who works there should feel lucky to get to work at a place that has such a cool mentality about it, which is probably why they're growing.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to work there. I don't think I have enough letters in front of my name.
Who knows? I'm sure they offer a variety of jobs.
Although he did say storytelling is very important, and we're pretty dang good at that, I think.
We are.
But, they're doing science with a purpose, right? They're not just collecting data. They're creating solutions from that data. And that's kind of a change in how scientists have been thinking over the last 20 years.
Right.
It used to be just, we give you the information and you make your decisions about it. And now there's this whole element of advocacy that comes into it. Like, we're the ones who have this information. We think with our evidence that this is the best path forward. And that's kind of a really interesting shift that's been happening in the scientific community.
Right. It's kind of like, how can we create solutions and implement solutions without having to be like, oh, here's the data, you do with it whatever you want to. It's like, okay, we have this. Now what are the next steps?
Yeah, definitely.
One of the quotes that I really liked from him in the episode was, how do we make it so a tree standing is worth more than a tree cut down? Because I think we've talked about this a few times over the years and over our seasons, is that nature is inherently important to us and probably to a lot of our listeners, but it's not to everyone. A dollar speaks, money kind of makes the world go round, and that's just the world that we live in currently. So I think it is so important to say not everyone has the view of, oh, this tree is here, it deserves to be here, it's providing these great services, so it should stay. A lot of people are in a situation where if they cut down the tree, they make money, they can feed their family. So it's like, how do we make another solution, another option for these people who aren't in a position to do anything else?
Yeah, environmental solutions have to make business sense. Otherwise, they're not viable solutions. It's just the way the world works.
Right.
And I think that he had a really good take on the mentality we have to have when we're seeking these solutions, that it has to work for everybody. Because if the choice is my family starves or I keep the tree, I'm not going to let my family starve. We're going to cut that tree down.
Right. And it sounds like that's a lot of the work that the Woodwell Climate Center does in general.
Really, really glad that we had the opportunity to chat with him. Before we sign off, I just want to shout out Collaboration Station here in Columbus, Georgia. This is our first set that's recorded in our new studio space. Got to play with some new toys. So really, really glad to be here. And you're going to be seeing a lot more of us once we get everything tuned up, because I think we're going to start dipping our toes into the world of video podcasting.
Yeah, so you'll be seeing some video clips from us hopefully soon. Obviously, already on our Instagram, you can find some reels that we do at our events outside of the studio, some with our speakers, some with other people. But we're hoping to do a little bit more of that, because that's what we've been getting asked for. So it's coming your way soon.
I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.